Hey guys, this is Wasim. I'm going to go over a quick crash course on how to create a web app using the Google App Engine framework, and I'm making this video for HackRice 2013. So Google App Engine is a platform that enables developers to build web applications on the same scalable systems that power a lot of Google's own applications. And by using Google App Engine, you inherently design your applications to be really scalable. And the other really nice thing about Google App Engine is that it supports Python. So if you're a freshman or sophomore following the computer science curriculum at Rice, chances are that your most comfortable language is Python right now. So the web application that I'm gonna build right now is a simple sticky notes application that uses Rice's NetID authentication system to let the user log in and jot down a few notes. It'll demonstrate how to build a very basic data store in Google App Engine and integrate CAS NetID authentication within your application. So in this video, I'm gonna assume that you're somewhat familiar with HTML, CSS, JavaScript, and what GET and POST web requests are, and what an Ajax request is. If you're not really familiar with these things or haven't heard about them, I suggest you look them up so that this video is able to make more sense to you. For this video, I'm going to use, to get started, you need a text editor and the Google App Engine app, which is available for Windows, Mac, and Linux. So go ahead and open up App Engine. And we're going to start off by creating our application. I'm going to go ahead and place it in my Git folder. And I'm going to call it Stickies. Now, we should be able to see this over here. Okay, great, there it is. Now, if you go ahead and click Run, you should get a basic Hello World application. It should show up on localhost 8080 for you if it's the first application. This is my second one, so it goes to 8081, and there you go. So Hello World is right there. So this is what the structure of the application basically looks like. You have a app.yaml file, which has the main application configuration. It basically defines what libraries are available to you and what web requests get mapped to which request handlers. We'll go over that in a little bit. So for this application, I'm going to use Twitter Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a framework, basically a collection of tools that are used for creating websites and web applications. It offers you HTML and CSS based design templates. So if you go to Twitter Bootstrap, you can download their package. And basically, we're going to take everything that's in the Bootstrap package, call it static, and place it within our application. Now, in order for it to be accessible through the application and be available in the HTML, we have to add a handler for it. So that's the reason I stuck everything within static, so that I can simply write an entry for it in app.yaml. Alright. So I've hacked together a very basic main page for the application, main.html. In the interest of time, I'm simply going to copy it over. Later, I'll make all of the files available. It's just a basic page that allows the user to sign in. Now, we're going to write I'm going to edit the code in main.py to actually render this page main.html upon opening the website. So right now you see hello world from the GET request that is delegated to the main handler in this application. And the reason that this file runs in the first place is because app.yaml directs us there. The dot star is basically a wildcard for any URL that's fetched gets directed to main.app. So we're going to go ahead and change this out. For that, we're going to use the Jinja library to actually render the web page. Now we can simply import it over here. So we're going to start off by defining a global variable that basically takes the local folder that this file is running from as a reference for loading different templates. So with that there, I can simply say load up our template from the Jinja environment, get template main.html. And let's try to run this now. So I made a minor mistake over here. It's not static folder, it's static directory. And let's change it out. So when things aren't working, the first place to check is the logs. And I'm probably going to be going back here pretty often. As you can see, it's pretty easy to make little mistakes like this. So I need to import OS. And there you go. So we have something basic over here. I think the CSS needs to be linked up correctly. So I'm going to change that out. So now our style sheets should be linked correctly, and also towards the bottom of the page we're loading jQuery. We're going to be using this later. jQuery lets you do a lot of it's a JavaScript library that lets you manipulate a lot of the elements, the HTML elements of your website. It's what makes a lot of websites, it gives them that responsiveness. So I'm going to copy in style sheet. Just wrote up some very basic definitions in there. Okay, so we have a basic page now. In order to make the sign-in work, we're going to use a little authentication model that I wrote. So I'm gonna take that out and copy these things over. So basically there's a few modules over here for authentication. There's a app engine config file and a cron job. Basically how the authentication works is that the application sends you to the CAS server that Rice runs, where you enter your Rice credentials, and CAS basically issues a ticket for you, which you grab and give it back to the website. The website then asks the CAS server whether this ticket is valid, and that establishes authentication. And then locally on the website, a new private session is instantiated so that you don't have to repeatedly authenticate yourself as you continue to use the website for a single session. So that is all done through Google App Engine sessions, which I found from GitHub by a developer. And the cron.yaml file basically cleans up the sessions every 24 hours, and it does it by using this cleanup session script. And the auth.py file is basically what we're using for authentication. So the functions that would be of interest to you are require login, which basically, if we were to write this over here in our main file, it would redirect the request and send the user to login. Now, two things we need to integrate the authentication package into our application is to allow the app.yaml file to request to direct these URL requests to this application auth.py. So in order to do that, we're going to edit our app.yaml file. And above, the ordering is important. Above main.app, we're going to take all URLs that begin with authenticate and direct them to authentication.auth.app. And the way this reference works is authentication refers to the folder over here, then auth refers to the Python module, and app is specifically inside auth.py right over here. And in order for basically the whole environment to be able to access this authentication folder, there has to be this empty init.py file which allows Python access into that package. Now, the reason that I mentioned that the ordering is important is that if this handler was above over here, then it would basically suck all of the requests and direct them to main.app because it's a wildcard. So we want to leave this on the bottom, and the ordering, because of this, the ordering actually matters. Now, the second thing we need to do to set up authentication is to actually make a secret cookie key that we should not expose and make public. And so here we're going to use a randomly generated key. So you can simply open up a terminal, open Python, import os, urandom64, take the string that you get, and paste it over here, and save it in a file called secretparams.py. That is what the authentication package accepts. So just to test this now, let's go ahead and import it over here. So from authentication.import auth, and here we should be able to write auth.require login, and this function takes a request handler as the argument, which is basically used to redirect the request. So we just pass that on. So let's refresh, and there you go. It's taken me to the RISE Central Authentication Service for me to log in. So it works. So this is not where we actually need it. That was just to test it. Where we do need it is within the stickies file. So I'm going to go ahead and implement a handler for that, and I'm going to place it within main.py. Normally I would make a separate file for this, but in the interest of time and for the sake of brevity, I'm just going to throw it in here. So we'll call it a sticky notes handler, and similarly it's going to take get requests. Now once you use the required login function, it establishes a local session. It'll establish a session and record the net ID of the user within this session. So in order to get access to that, we need to import this function. Now we can get access to the current session and check to make sure. Now this session, you can think of it, it's implemented exactly like a Python dictionary. So we can check for the existence of a key in this session. If it doesn't have a net ID, that means that the user isn't logged in. So we can require login. And here, the code terminates, like this request handler terminates. The way that this flow works is you have your application module, in our case main.py, that goes to auth.py. The request handler redirects you to CAS and that issues you a ticket. Now auth.py takes that response from CAS and then redirects you back to the app module. So once this function executes, the user will have logged in and will basically repeat this GET request. So over here, now we basically have the notion of a user with the authenticated net ID. But maybe we want to establish more information about this user. So now would be a good time to create our first database entity, a basic user. So for that, we need to import the database API, and we'll create a class called user. Basically, our user for now is just gonna store a net ID property, and this is required to keep the entity consistent. What we're using over here is for the database is Google's GQL, which is a SQL query language for the database. If you want to read more about that, simply visit their website. So over here now, we're gonna implement a convenience function for actually getting a user based off of the net ID. And we'll have a flag which has a default value of false, which means that we want to get a user based off of a net ID, and if create is true, then that user keyed by that net ID will be created in the database before it's fetched. Otherwise, the function will simply return none. So we query the database for a user where net ID is 1. Now you don't type the net ID directly into the string of the query. In order to let Google automatically escape the string for and sanitize it for security methods, this is the syntax that you use. Simply, if you were checking for more attributes and net ID is so and name is that, you just basically number them and mention them over here like this. So right now we only have one property, which is net ID, that we're trying to match over here. And we're going to go ahead, that's the query, and we're going to do a get. Get returns the first result of the query. If you leave it like this, you can iterate over the query. So maybe if this was users, you're expecting more than one user, you can iterate over the users and work with that data. But we're only trying to fetch one entity. So if the user doesn't exist and we want to create one, then we simply instantiate a new user whose net ID is equivalent to the function argument, and we place it in the database. That's what the put does. And we simply return the user. Okay, great. So now we have a basic notion of a user. We can use this function that we implemented right over here. And if the user doesn't exist, we'll go ahead and create it. Now would be a good time to test things out. So we're going to specify a URL for the sticky notes handler. We'll call it stickies, and we'll assign it to sticky note handler. I'm going to save this. Okay. So let's go back and start all over. I'm going to clear the logs. So App Engine has a built-in library for logging, which comes in really handy during development, and when your website is deployed, you basically have logs of of things that matter to you that you can record as users are using the website. So I'm going to go ahead and import logging. There are several levels of logging you can do. There's logging.info, logging.warning, logging.error, and I think there's also logging.critical. So here we're just going to go ahead and print out the user database entity. So now let's click sign in. I'm going to go ahead and log in. And as you can see in the logs, in main.py in line 50, it has created a user entity for me, and that's the database key for it. So line 50. So we've gotten this far pretty good. Next, let's go ahead and create our sticky note. So we're going to have a sticky, and it's going to have a user, and so that's basically a relationship over here. So we use a reference property. Again, this is required. A sticky needs to have a user and owner. We're also going to record the time when the sticky was made, and if you use this flag, the date time will be recorded automatically when this entity is created. And we're going to have a title for the sticky, which is required, and a note, the actual content of the sticky note, which is not required. Title is a string property, which I think has a limit of 500 characters. The note is text, which has a greater capacity. So now that we have actually created our notion of a sticky note, we need some way for the user to actually input this data and create stickies so we can store them in our database. So I'm going to go ahead and for now assume that our database doesn't have any sticky notes. So I'm going to create an empty list and assign this as my page data and fetch my template. Now this is very similar to what we did with main.html, but here we're going to specify an argument as we render the template. What I didn't explain earlier was that Jinja is a templating library. So what it lets you do is separate out the markup, the semantics and the presentation of your content and the actual data that is inside of it. It lets you separate the two into basically your data and then your view. So in order to do that, you need to write some templating code within your HTML file. So we're going to go ahead and fetch stickies.html. Let's see, that didn't work. Okay, I'm gonna copy it. All right, so we have our basic page. Let me fix that again. So basically, I'm going to place all of my stickies over here, and I'm going to ID it by stickies. And this is where the Jinja code comes in. So I'm going to have in the template that I rendered, which uses page data, I have a key called stickies. So I can use it right over here, iterate over stickies. And let's go ahead and copy paste some of this code. So this is quite self-explanatory. Everything that's within this for loop is going to get rendered repeatedly on the page for each sticky. And for every sticky, we're dereferencing its ID, title, and the note. I'll get back to why we need the ID. And this will basically print out all of the stickies that are rendered from main.py. And the other thing that we need is a form for the user to actually be able to input the stickies information. Okay, now that's there. So let's reload this page. Okay, we need to, what happened over here? Aha, I think I haven't saved main.py. Okay, perfect. All right, looking good. So now I'm going to go over, we're going to switch gears a bit, and I'm going to show how to write a little bit of basic JavaScript code to make the post request, which will send a new sticky note entered by the user. So we're going to use jQuery, and actually instead of JavaScript, I'm going to use CoffeeScript, which is basically a cleaner version of JavaScript. It compiles down to JavaScript code, and it's really nice in the sense that the syntax of the language is much more easier to comprehend, and it's much more terse. So in order to actually access the title, we'll be using this ID, input title, and to actually access the contents of the note, we'll be using input text. So let's go ahead and make a file called stickies.coffee. Now, in order to actually compile this CoffeeScript down to JavaScript, you're going to need a CoffeeScript compiler. You should be able to easily find that on the internet and use it. I'm also using a Sublime Text plugin, which lets me just compile the file with a keystroke. So first things first, I want to actually log that the script ran. So I'm going to save this and compile it into CoffeeScript. And I'm going to go here and make sure the page is loaded after the jQuery is loaded. So script static js stickies.js. And it ran. So that's good. Now let's go back over there and do something more interesting. So The first thing we need to do is add an event handler when the add. So basically over here, I'm using jQuery, which is the $, to specifically select the HTML content that is ID'd by add button and binding the event handler, which I'm about to write, based off of when it's clicked. Now, because it's a submit button, one of the default things that happens with that is it 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 it'll trigger a post request, but we want to actually stop that one because we want a more dynamic response that shows up immediately on that page. So here you can see the button right over here, and it's ID'd by add button. So going back over here, we're going to build a dictionary which will have the title, and this is basically going to be input title dot value, and then the actual node, which is the input text, which I should really be calling input node for consistency. Now, just a very basic little validation. In our data store, we made title required, so here we should check to make sure that title is filled out. So we can write something along the lines of if post data title dot trim. Now trim will get rid of the leading and trailing white space in case the user has put any. And actually I should be doing that right over here. So we should be entering trimmed data. So post data title is an empty string, which really I can just write if not post data. Then we can do a simple alert of missing input and stop the function right there. And so let's quickly test that. Okay, great. And if I type something, and now it won't do that. So we're looking good right now. Here I'll make the Ajax request. So basically Ajax stands for asynchronous JavaScript and XML. It was a series of technologies. It doesn't specifically refer to one thing, but it was a kind of an acronym. It was interrelated web development techniques that were basically used to create more asynchronous web applications. Applications like Google Maps and Gmail are really good examples of this, where things kind of happen really responsively on the page rather than you submitting a request and then waiting for the server to respond with another page. You directly get the relevant data from the server and render it on the page using client-side programming such as JavaScript. So over here, we're going to make an Ajax call, and this URL we're going to use is stickies, and the type is going to be post. I have to actually enter that in string. The data, now here in the data, what's typically entered is key value pair dictionary. And if the data is more complex, it's better to encode it in JSON, which is JavaScript object notation. It's a standard that's become really popular, and you can think of it as a data structure that supports dictionaries and lists, and it's really convenient to use. So out of habit, I'm gonna use it right here. So I'm going to take my post data and turn it into a JSON string, which is keyed by JSON in the data. And now we need to, when this Ajax call is made to the server, we need to define what happens when the server responds back. If you write any code over here, it's gonna get executed immediately after the Ajax call is made. The Ajax call is asynchronous. So your code over here cannot depend on something that is relied through the Ajax call. So that has to fall in a success function. So here we define a function. The arrow stands for defining a function. It's pretty brief. And we'll take our response from the server, and let's switch gears over here actually. So we're making this Ajax call to stickies with a post request with this data. So let's go to main.py. And this is where we've defined a handler for sticky, and it supports get requests. So get is exactly what it sounds like. It's used for getting data from the server, loading web pages. Post is used for making changes in the most cases, which is like posting data. So here we'll define a handler for post, and we'll do a really quick authentication once again. So if the user is not logged in, then you should be returning some kind of error code or some message to the front end. Right now, to save time, I'm not going to worry about that. You can probably find out online how to do this. So again, we'll use our convenience function to get the user object. We'll get the data. Let's go ahead and import JSON. So we encoded it into a string. Now we need to load it back from that string. And by getting the JSON parameter from our request, which we just wrote up in the CoffeeScript, we're able to get this data. So I'm going to go ahead and log this data. Okay. Here we'll write this down and do another quick test. It's always great to test in small increments, make sure things are still working. So I'm going to click that. All right. So I forgot to compile my CoffeeScript. Let's do this again. Okay, great. And so as you can see on the right, we're receiving the request on the back end. We're going to ignore the error on the client side right now because we're not quite done there yet. So we're getting the note, we're getting the title in the form of a dictionary. So let's go ahead and save this data. What we want to do is store this in the database and return it back to the client, the title and the note, and also include the database ID of the sticky. So let's create our sticky object where the user is going to be our user, title we'll get from data, and the note as well. We'll go ahead and place it in the database. And now we'll take our data dictionary and add the ID of the sticky, which is basically the string of the key object of the sticky entity. And we'll go ahead and write this back in our response. So again, we have to use json.dumps, which will encode it back into a string. So loads decodes it, and on the CoffeeScript side, we use json.parse to decode the data. So with that, now we can write the rest of the code to actually see what happens. So great, it worked. We got back a success. Oh, I think I forgot to compile my CoffeeScript again, but nonetheless, it worked. As you can see in the logs over here, we've saved an entity. Now let's go ahead and actually try to print this out. So, or actually, we've already written that code there in the Jinja template. So if we refresh this page now, let's see. Okay, so we've written the templating code. However, we are not loading it in the data. So here, let's write a GQL query to actually load up the data. So let's write down a query stickies is equal to sticky.gql where user equals user. That'll get us all the stickies for this user. We'll iterate through these stickies and append them to our data structure where ID is going to be the key of the sticky, the title is going to be that, and then the note within the sticky. Okay, and I think that should do it. So let's go ahead and try it out. Oh, something broke. I type a bit too fast for my own good. Global name stickies is not defined. I also need to learn how to spell. Stickies data. More misspellings. And there we go. Okay, sweet. Well, that's pretty lame though, right? I mean, I don't want to constantly refresh my page each time I create a new sticky note. So how about we dynamically load it into the page after getting the success callback from our Ajax request. So here, let's get the ID from the response, the title, and we're going to construct a jQuery HTML object. And I'm going to go ahead and fast forward. Okay, there we go. So that's basically the same HTML we wrote in the Jinja template for rendering the notes, the stickies. Here, by using the inverted commas, I'm able to enter hashtag ID over here in this format, and that lets me dereference that within the string. So that's kind of handy over here. And same goes for here for title and note. Now I have this HTML object and I need to insert it into my document. So let's go to stickies.html. Here we have a div with keyed by IDs. Its ID is stickies, so let's type that over here. And then we can use a jQuery function prepend to add it to the top of the list. And in order to kind of add this nice looking animation, we can initially hide it and then slide it down. So let's test this out. Okay. And there you go. And now we pretty much have it right on the spot. We don't need to refresh the page anymore. So this is pretty convenient now. So now we have a basic application that has authentication. It lets you log in and post sticky notes. I'm gonna go ahead and implement one tiny little thing as well, the ability to delete notes. So in order to do that, we have this nice little X button over here, and it's a button which has a class type of close, and we can use this kind of unique identification to bind a function to all such buttons. So let's go ahead and write this function first. We'll call it delete sticky. It's another function, and really the enclosing HTML of the sticky is the parent of this button. So you look at this button and it has a div which is really the parent. So we need to grab onto that. So the scope from where this function will get called, this refers to the actual jQuery selector that we use, which is going to be the button. So this refers to the button. So we grab the parent of the button. And this is where the ID comes in handy, because the database needs to know what the ID of the sticky is in order to be able to delete this. So we use the data ID, which is embedded in the HTML. So let's go back over here. And as you can see, data ID equals sticky.id. So that part is dereferenced over here. Now let's make another quick Ajax call. We use the delete URL, which we haven't implemented yet. We'll use post again, and here I'm just going to use a simple direct parameter without using JSON, because there's literally just one parameter over here. And the success function, again, there's not much. We can just to keep things simple in this case, and just for the point of this example, I'm gonna just use this string as the identifier for success. So this is looking good. Let's go ahead and compile this and implement on the server side. Let's make another handler, call it delete, and we need to implement another web app request handler for this. We'll call it the garbage handler. So it needs to handle post requests. Let's do the same thing again with the authentication. Now here I want to point out that a user can hand write an Ajax request, and let's say they grab the ID of someone else's sticky in some manner. We don't want them to write an Ajax request to delete someone else's sticky. They should only be able to delete their own stickies. So we should actually verify that over here. So we can do that by getting the sticky ID, and let's retrieve it from the database. So sticky.get sticky ID will retrieve it from the database. If it doesn't exist, it'll return none. But I'm not going to check for that over here right now, because it's the only time someone would actually try to delete someone else's sticky is a malicious intent. I'm just going to write an assertion to be lazy over here. So the code will crash over here if someone tries to delete someone else's sticky. But if it passes through that, Now, notice you can't directly compare the sticky.user with the user because uh, that will compare the pointers to the user in memory. So what you need to compare is their keys. And after making that assertion, you can go ahead and simply call delete on the sticky and write success. Let's go ahead and test this. So we refresh and hit X. Oh, something didn't work. Oh, okay. So I forgot to actually bind the event. So we will select. Now everything that goes in this jQuery function will be run when the document gets loaded. That's why we encapsulate this in the jQuery function, because we don't want this script to run before the HTML is loaded, which will cause very weird errors that are hard to explain. So here we're selecting all buttons, specifically those whose class equals close, and we're going to bind the delete sticky function to all of these buttons. So let's refresh and try again. I forgot to compile. Okay. And it works. So you can see here in the logs, the sticky gets deleted. A little caveat, something that might not be so obvious is, if we create a new node, you can't delete it. And the reason is that the delete sticky function was bound to all the close buttons upon the initial load of the document. So here we need to write the same handler, basically a trigger for deleting this. So once you do this, we should be able to delete this. I think I might have forgotten to compile again. This is a recurring thing. Okay, let's see. And there we go. So great. And there you have it. And last but not least, I'll go ahead and add a little logout button so our user can safely log out from the website. So I'm gonna paste it right over here. It's in the authentication module, I've written a handler called logout, which will take as a parameter destination where you can enter a URL where the user will be returned on your website back after the logout. So we just want to go back to the home page. So effectively, after logging the user out, it'll bring the user back to the URL of the website / home in this case. So after having added that, we have that, and I can click sign out. Well, that didn't work. I need to actually handle that request. So I'm gonna add a wildcard right there, and now that works. So for simplicity, I've added a wildcard which will, regardless of whatever you type in the URL, anything other than stickies and delete will bring you to the home page. So let's try this again. Test node. There it is. I'm gonna go ahead and sign out. That works. I'm gonna sign back in, and the node still exists. And there you have it. And the last thing I'm gonna quickly show you is how to deploy this online. It's really effortless. You go to appengine.google.com, you check for an app whether it's available. Yes, it's available. I'm gonna go ahead and create the application. In the meanwhile, I called it Rice Stickies, so I go to app.yaml and I'll call it Rice Stickies. Make sure the name matches, and it's registered successfully. So with the same user account, I can go right over here, hit deploy, and it begins the deployment process. And once the application has been deployed, we should be able to go to ricestickies.appspot.com. And there you go. Pretty much have the application online, and it's really effortless to deploy the application. And the version that you have as development on your own computer reflects and translates almost identically on the production side. So I guess this video is not as short as I thought it would be, but thanks for checking it out.